Dr. Black, thanks for joining me. I wanted to pick your brain, have an open conversation. It's unscripted. Just wanted to get your thoughts. There's been a lot in the last couple of months. There's a lot of social anxiety in the United States, and a lot of good people are doing good work, and institutions are starting to change and address some systematic inequality. But I guess I'm confused as to the terminology that people are using. I hear a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion, and I think where my mind started to become suspicious is I always hear diversity, equity, inclusion. I don't hear equity, diversity, inclusion. I don't hear inclusion, diversity, equity. So I'm wondering, like, the origins of that particular order, if you have any thoughts about that, and if not, I just want to, I guess, start by asking you what does diversity mean to you as both an academic and a citizen?
Hmm. I'm going to go an unexpected route on why it's DEI versus IED or EID. Diversity is a term I think that came into predominant use or dominant use rather first before the other two terms, but also again, unexpected answer here. I think to say diversity, equity, inclusion is the closest acronym that gives us sort of a word sounding version of that. DEI, it's easier to say, sort of linguistically, it flows better. But again, I think diversity is a word that we've been using longer to talk about issues of race, culture, socio-political status. So I think regardless if it couldn't be DIE, because that's a word and that's a negative connotation. It couldn't be IED because that's a weapon. So DEI, I think, for multiple reasons, is where it's landed. And what diversity means to me.
Well, actually, let me jump in there
Yeah.
because you're saying that the reason it starts with diversity, besides the acronym, is that it's been in our lexicon longer. Do you think it's a rejection of the word multicultural or multiculturalism? Is that because I know that word has been criticized in the past? Do you think that diversity is synonymous with that or replacing that?
I don't think they're synonymous. I think for a lot of people, they could be synonymous. I know in terms of education and educational research, multiculturalism was, big in the early 2000s, late 90s. It was sort of a catchphrase, jargon. Diversity as well has been sort of jargon, but longer. So it sort of stood the test of trends in education. I think multiculturalism for the larger population is more complex, more complicated to think about. What does culture even mean, let alone multiculturalism? Diversity, we all know what the word diverse means, different.
Diversity to you is a stepping stone or a first step into a conversation that might in academia include multiculturalism, but that diversity is more accessible to the
Yeah.
average person or as an entry point.
Yeah, diversity is more of a democratized term, I think.
So what does it mean
To me, or what does it mean to culture at large?
to you, Dr. Black?
As a white academic, the intersectionality of my identities it complicates what I think diversity means. Queer, white, lesbian from the South in America. Uh, there's a lot to unpack there. Do I think I'm diverse in terms of my family? Absolutely. Do I think I'm diverse in terms of Southern culture? Yes. Do I think I'm diverse in terms of American culture? No, not at all. I'm just another white woman. And in recent decades, with LGBTQ rights expanding, that bit of diversity in my intersectional identity is decreasing as well, which isn't a negative or a positive. It just is, in my
Yeah.
view. I think
Would you then argue then your gender is also diminishing? There's not as much of a bookend of beginning of expansion of rights to assimilation, but we've had the women's rights movement for decades as well, and initiatives to address gender inequality. So would you say that your gender identity is diminishing as well?
I don't think my gender identity has ever sort of played in my mind as a point of diversity in my life, other than in my nuclear family as being the only female child. But women are half the population, a little bit over half the population. So in that sense, my gender identity does not make me very diverse if I'm the majority of.
I'm glad you clarified, because when you said that about your family, I actually was interpreting that you were bringing in your education as part of your diversity, but you meant being the only female of your generation in the nuclear family or the extended family.
Yeah, but my education as well. That's a valid point that I wasn't thinking about. I would diversify me more within my family. My family is educated, but yes, in terms of educational level, I do stand out.
So diversity, I hear you saying that diversity is almost like a sliding scale, that it requires a triangulation, if you will, because you're placing yourself in a chronological era, as well as not just in relationship to American society, but it sounds like you're putting it in a triangulation to whoever or whomever or whatever the issue or person is that's being discussed.
Yeah, I think diversity, and again, I'm speaking from my perspective, which is white, female, queer, Southern, educated. I think diversity is relative for me. I cannot say diversity is relative for someone else, no matter if I see their diversity as relative either, but I do think we have to contextualize our own sense of diversity, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. I mean, the hamster wheels are spinning, because just to play out as an example, a concrete example, that if you were in a social unit, in a meeting, or in a group of people, and to the best of your knowledge, everybody else there was heterosexual, then your diversity would be more poignant. But that if you were in a community where there were other, you use the word queer, which I'd love to discuss that too at some point. Where I grew up and how I grew up, I'm uncomfortable with that term. So if you were in a population or a social setting where there were other people who were gay or non heterosexual, then your diversity diminishes. So that's that sliding scale we kind of talked about. But then the other thing that you made me think about is in this era of social anxiety, and I don't know how best to describe the last 4 or 5 months without using loaded language, but also without diminishing it. But I have heard people say, this is not your time, white woman. And so then your gender and your racial background also then is diminished in the setting that we're in right now. Is that what you're saying? And would you agree with that statement?
I do agree with that statement. And I think diversity is a sliding scale, but it's multiple sliding scales. We think of sort of like a theater production soundboard or lighting board where you have multiple sliding scales to raise levels at certain times or what have you. I don't think diversity can just be one sliding scale. It's multiple because of the intersectionality of identities we all carry around. And, I listed 4 or 5 of mine, but there are multiple more: daughter, whatever, sister. In terms of it's not your time, white woman, I do agree with that. I do. And since, first and second wave feminism, with the complications of the relationship between white women still fighting for equality, continuing simultaneously as African American women fighting for basic human rights and equality, gender equality, we've never achieved that fully in America.
Right.
So I do think white women need to be more allies than at this moment, rather than sort of saying, yeah, but what about me too?
So
And
how
not
would
me
you
too in
know
the
that
sense
the
of
moment has passed? Because as you said, that all of these initiatives and movements for expanding equality and equity to all intersectionalities, which is another word maybe we should define. But so how would you then know that the moment has passed and it is time then for Black and white women to partner together for women's rights as opposed to Black women's rights? Like, I hear you saying that the time is not now. how will you know when the time is again?
Well, I think maybe I wasn't clear in my last answer. It's always time for white women and black women to partner
Hmm.
to fight for black women's rights. I think it's always time for black women and white women to partner and fight for female equality. I think we as white women just need to recognize that we have that privilege, again, that black women do not. Therefore, our sliding scale is a little bit different. And when we are finally at a point, which I don't see happening anytime soon, where black women are elevated in terms of their rights and their liberties and equity, then we can
Mm.
then we can talk about, okay, well, it's time for white women, whatever. However, I don't see that time as being a distinctive moment, because I don't think we in America will get to where black women are fully equal in terms of rights and social equality without white women being pushed first to their goal. It's not going to happen, in my opinion, unfortunately.
You know what? As a historian, what I'm interpreting, or how I'm processing what you're saying, is I'm thinking about the civil rights movement in the 1960s, where there was a competition of civil rights,
Mm-hmm.
really, between the women's rights movement and the African American rights movement, which then uniquely put African American women in a very awkward position, because my understanding is that there was resentment from the male leadership of the civil rights movement among the African American community, and then there was also a lack of inclusion, inclusiveness of black women in the women's rights movement. So does that kind of gel with what you're saying, that there's this almost like, should not be, but there is a competition of movements, and somehow you have to have a stepping back to kind of see how these moving parts fit together, and how you can best push everybody's rights forward without dominating?
Yeah, absolutely. And we can't forget that at the same time we are fighting for Black Americans' rights, women's rights, Black women's rights, we also are fighting for queer rights. And they got pushed even further back in this competition, especially women of color who were queer at that time. So you have all of these, yeah, absolutely competing factors. However, it's not necessarily, the competition is not coming from within. The competition factor is coming from outside forces,
Like
culture,
the
and
media?
society at large.
The media, maybe? Or
The media is certainly part of it, as they are a part of all sort of pushing good and bad information. But just the this. I don't want to overuse the term patriarchal society, but in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that is still very dominant, still dominant today. But this sense that you have to, the American idea that you have to be first, you have to be the winner. We're all ingrained with the sense of competition. So, okay, me first, then you. And I think that's just sort of inherent in everything we do in terms of social movements, political movements. We all have to win.
if there's such a thing as like a national consciousness too, you can almost frame it in terms of an attention span. That the national consciousness only has a certain amount of bandwidth for attention, and so maybe that's where that competition comes from. It's a competition for a national attention in an organic kind of way, if you were to personify the society. I want to go back to the terms. Like we've been using a bunch of terms, and I got a sense of how you pictured diversity and diversity's relationship with multiculturalism. But you also used multiple times the word intersectionality, and that's, isn't that one of those newer words? I don't think I've heard the word. I don't know if I heard the word more than 4 years ago. And it could be that I was slow to catching up to that term, but tell me where that term comes from, if you know, and what that means to you.
Yeah, it actually comes from critical race theorists and critical race theory writing. And it essentially is this idea that we essentialize our identities, but we can't, nor should we. So, for instance, you, Tom, you are a professor, you are a male, you are a white male, you are a father, you are a son. I think you're a brother. You are a friend, you are an enemy, right? You are a guy on the streets. You are all of these things at once all of these identities intersect in order to make your ultimate identity of Tom Keefe.
I know you've seen some of my presentations and some of my work on identity construction. So is it synonymous with, or is it an expansion of when I present on like the big five or the big four of like race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, and ethnicity, if I hadn't said that one? Is it, so it sounds like intersectionality is that, but then also it's very relational the way you described it. You were positioning me in relation to others and showing how those relationships are different. So it's not just demographics, but it's a combination of maybe of demographics and relationships.
It is, but I mean, we could also look at religion, right? Your religion is really not in relation to anything, especially if you grow up one religion and then change, or have no religion and then find a religion later. Sometimes religious identity can be relational, but it's demographics, it's relational, it's personality, it's all of these things. And so critical race theorists are saying you can't, when intersectionality became a sort of scholarly discourse, they were saying you can't just say Black woman as an identity, because there are too many multiplicities of identity and too many intersections of identity within that, such as a queer Black woman, such as a straight Black woman, or all of these other identities.
Regionalism, a Black woman from the North, a Black woman from the South, education, right?
Right. So we can't just say, when we're talking about building diversity programs and expanding diversity or multiculturalism or these other terms, we can't just rely on the Black woman experience, because intersectionality tells us that's a multiplicity of identities and experiences.
Couldn't this be dangerous though? Couldn't it be almost reductionist that there is no such thing as diversity because we are all diverse in our intersectionality?
Is that a very white thing to say though? I don't know.
I don't know. I don't even know how to answer your question. What I'm saying is, you were saying that I have intersectionality, but I'm very privileged. I'm the personification of white privilege, white male privilege, white male heterosexual privilege, white male Christian privilege. So, but yet you're still opening the door, it sounds like, that I still have intersectionality. And so therefore, that in one of those relationships, demographic factors, or lived experiences, here's an example. I have been in my life a victim of crime, of violent crime. That has affected me and how I relate to people and situations. But if I showed up at a DEI meeting and said, I'm here because I'm diverse, because I'm a victim of violent crime, I think that would, first of all, be relatively obnoxious and entitled, and not really what we mean when we're talking about diversity.
Right.
So my intersectionality is not necessarily synonymous with diversity. Is that?
It's not synonymous with the definition of diversity we have all accepted as the definition of diversity we're going to use to promote equity for other races.
So I can be diverse through my intersectionality, but because I'm economically privileged, it's a different path than a diversity which carries with it socioeconomic baggage and or discrimination. And that's how we're using the word diversity?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly, in my mind, boils down to racial identity and the intersectionality that goes along with racial identity, such as a lower socio-cultural status, lower economic status, bias, prejudice, perhaps violence based on race. But then, so yes, you are diverse for sure. If we were to stand you next to 10 other white, straight Christian guys, you're all diverse, which, to your point, sort of negates the idea of diversity in that sense. So I think you're absolutely right. The way we are using diversity and diverse is a very specific racial connotation.
Can I push you on that? Because it's not even really racial, is it? Isn't it black and white? Because maybe it's my regionalism. Maybe somebody who lives in a part of the country that has a higher population of East Asian Americans or Indigenous Americans, maybe they would feel differently. But I feel like when we say race, we really mean black and white. And then it's almost an afterthought to think about East Asian Americans or Indigenous Americans. Is that fair? Or
that is incredibly fair. There's been quite a bit of research done regarding Asian Americans as the quote unquote model minority because they, and I'm paraphrasing ideas here, they don't tend to make noise. They don't tend to organize and fight for their rights. They don't tend to do what the Black and African Americans do, which is point out the problems with white society.
And also there's that the resentment therefore that builds up in non-East Asian minority populations, because that I've heard the expression that they're white-ish, you know, that, and in terms of assimilation and educational professional success stories, that it is a different lived experience than the West African that becomes African American experience, and the Hispanic experience for sure, and the Indigenous experience predating all of that, right?
Yeah, I have a story, a family story. So my mom's second husband, my stepdad, best man on the planet, his I will repeat, best man who used to be on the planet. How about that? His first wife was Japanese American, and she was born in Japan. Her dad was an American GI, married a Japanese woman, brought her over, and they moved to about an hour and a half south of Jackson, Mississippi in the 1950s and the 1960s. And I had to do this class project as an undergrad for my anthropology class, I believe. And so I did an oral history of her. And I asked her about living in Mississippi as a young Japanese American woman who identified very strongly as Japanese during civil rights, during race riots, all of that in Mississippi at the time. And she said, you know, there was a lot going on between black and white, but I tell you, I've never been so happy to be yellow. And I think that sort of speaks to, you know, the model minority issue, the sort of, we tend to forget the emphasis on black versus white, as you pointed out. Yeah, absolutely. When we're talking about race in America, we are talking about black versus white.
I would share as well, as a, not an antithesis, but a different lived experience, the Supreme Court case on Japanese internment. And I don't want to mispronounce the name, so I'll skip over the name of the case, but the gentleman was eventually released from prison, and he died almost just after being released from prison. His daughter, a Japanese Hawaiian American, then became not just one of the leaders of the reconciliation and reparations movement for Japanese Americans, but also became an activist with the Black Panthers, and lived an entire lifetime of social justice and civil rights for everybody. So there are crossovers as well, and I guess, you know, this is me pontificating, because that's what Catholics get to do, because we have a pope, we get to pontificate, is that it goes back to my research with dehumanization too, that unfortunately there seems to be a competition for victimization and a competition for attention, as we were talking about before. What about the words equity and inclusion? So if diversity means racial diversity, and within racial diversity, it really means black and white. So what is it to be inclusive then, or to be equitable? I'm not even sure which word to tackle first.
Yeah, I think inclusion also goes along those same lines of diversity. I think when we hear we're trying to be more inclusive, first and foremost, we're talking about black versus white, we're talking about race. But coming from that term, from my perspective as a museum professional and art educator, when we use the term inclusive, we are also talking about, and again, this is in museum terms, we're talking about opening up programming to youth, to encourage youth. We're talking about programming for LGBTQ identities. We're talking about
physical abilities as well, right?
Physical abilities as well, yeah. So I think inclusive does fall right in line with diversity, but it's just a little bit more open and pulls away from race. When we're talking about equity, I mean, what comes to my mind is economic equity, and that tends to span race. But as always, because we don't have racial equality, and we're not focused on diversity, and not everybody has the same rights as everybody else in this country. I mean, equity still focuses on Black Americans.
I'm not going to let you get away with combining inclusion and equity there. So two follow-up questions. You can go in either order. How does inclusivity or inclusion not become tokenism? And in terms of equity, how does equity not become reverse discrimination and all of that, the pushback against and affirmative action programs, and where almost the phrase affirmative action is in white culture a very, very loaded and despised expression. So my question for you, in no particular order, how does inclusivity not become tokenism, and how does equity not become reverse discrimination?
Well, I think if you're doing inclusivity correctly, if that's a way to term that, then inclusivity means inclusivity. You're including everyone. So to your point, physical, considering the physical abilities, considering sexual identity, considering age identity, considering racial identity, socioeconomic identity. You know, many museums have free days and things like that, which I could go on about that and how that's problematic too. So I think that's how you make inclusivity not become tokenism. If you're really looking at the word include, right? Everybody.
Well, I'll add another IN word, but the problem is it's not measurable, and I think that's one of the problems with a lot of these issues that we're talking about, is that I think if I was to answer my own question, how does inclusivity or inclusion not become tokenism? It's about the intent, right? It's intentional inclusivity, but how do you ever know what the intent of and the heart and the mind of a person is? And so
I don't think that's part of inclusivity. I don't think, again, and I'm coming at it from a museum perspective. Museums, yes, they're interested in people's hearts and minds, but it's demographic based. And whether that's right or wrong, and that is measurable. You can measure, and museums do measure, the amount of, say, physically challenged individuals visiting their museum versus the total in the population, right?
But isn't that, to be cynical, isn't that also tied to marketing and staying open, that museums are being inclusive in order to find new populations, because the traditional college educated elite white male and females, that population is declining, and also that population is not sustaining the same level of economic support for museums. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of intention, because you could have two museums doing the same thing externally, but one could be looking at their bottom line and how do we stay in business, and the other one could be truly wanting to be exclusive and opening up museum arts and museum studies to all people.
Yeah, and I think that is a common, not misperception about museums, and I don't want to get us off track on museums, but the intention behind looking at the bottom line and looking at the budget is all related to, yes, certain populations dying off and losing support, but also to socioeconomic factors historically within museums, where it is a very specific demographic funding the museums out of their own personal foundations, or, you know, Rockefeller, et cetera, et cetera. That is no longer the case. But just to say a museum is only after the money and younger populations to keep the money coming in, that's not the intention of most museums. It is actually inclusivity.
I have an example of inclusivity in museums that it's actually an anecdote that you shared with me. So if I could prompt you, if you remember the conversation we had, when you and I first met, you were telling me about an exhibition at a museum in Minneapolis, and it had to do with, I don't want to give too much of the story away but if you remember the story, jump in at any point. It had to do with the inclusion of gay artists in the museum. Do you remember this conversation?
Mm-hmm.
So tell me how that fits with what we're talking about in terms of inclusivity versus tokenism.
Well, I think in that particular case, where there's an entire room, entire gallery centered and displaying and highlighting gay American and European painters of the early 20th century. It can go both ways. It can be tokenism and it can be inclusivity. Unless one was or is aware that all of those artists in that gallery were gay men predominantly, the average visitor would just see it as another gallery of modern art.
That was exactly the point. I'm sorry, I cut you off, but I was hoping that's what you're going to say. That's what stuck with me when you told me that story, that it was not advertised as a gay painters exhibition, right? Mm-hmm. It was advertised as an exhibition, and that you would have to, and they were queer, but that you would have to know that, and it whether you knew it or didn't know it didn't take away from the exhibition and the art.
Not at all. It's sort of like, I heard someone say this a while back on Facebook, because you know how Facebook can get. If you're going to do good deeds, do them quietly, otherwise they don't really count. Mm-hmm. And I think, not to say that that particular gallery was a good deed, but I think it's helping move us from tokenism to more pure inclusivity.
Amen. I would agree with that. So let's tackle that last word of DEI. We're doing it in a little bit different order. We've talked about diversity and multiculturalism. We've talked about intersectionality. We talked about inclusivity and inclusion. So the E word, I'll start off by just saying, I tell everybody I don't believe in equality at all. I believe in equity. So what is that phrase, either my phrase, mean to you, or what does equity mean to you?
I will agree with you that I don't believe in equality because it's a meaningless term that I think people like to throw around and think they know what it means when in actuality they don't. I propose equity for all as well. There was a comic strip several years ago with the boxes, right?
It's the best ever, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so perfect, right?
But you explained that cartoon out loud, and then I'll come back with the second greatest cartoon. So.
Okay. So this cartoon, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a minute, but there's a shorter individual trying to look over a fence and a taller individual trying to look over the same fence. Equality would be giving them the same size, same height box to stand on, which means that the shorter person still can't see over the fence and the taller person can see more over the fence. Equity would be giving them boxes in relation to the size they need to see over the fence.
Right. Perfect. And then when the discussions of equity and equality then get brought into pedagogy and learning outcomes and assessment, then there's also a cartoon, and it, you have your principal, teacher, professor, what have you, and there's three students, and the student A is a monkey, student B is a fish, and yes. Student C is I don't remember. Do you remember, like, let's say a turtle, and then the assessment is climb the tree. Mm-hmm. That's an equal assessment. All three students have an equal access to that assessment, but it doesn't take a monkey brain to know that the monkey's going to do a little bit better than the turtle and the fish, right?
Absolutely.
So equity is not just, I like your phrase, giving people or helping people with what they need to be successful or to achieve their desired goals, but it's also to make sure that we're assessing people based on their abilities and not based on other expectations. I'll give you another example, not as good as our cartoons, but the SATs and standardized tests have been criticized for years because of the classist language that they use. And this is a true story. It happened to me during my PSATs, but I didn't really think about it until years afterwards, because again, not just my white privilege, but my regional privilege of growing up in New England, in Rhode Island. And the question was, it was an analogy. It was something like ensign is to yacht as pony is to horse, or something like that. And I just remember thinking how that was the easiest question in the world until I was entering into this conversation that only somebody from a coastal or a nautical culture would know what an ensign was. Mm-hmm. So that question was not measuring intelligence. It was measuring class and regionalism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like we continually say in our department, meet students where they are. Even society, meet people where they are. If we really want equity, then we have to get rid of this notion of equality, which always leads to the terrible argument about the evils of socialism and Marxism, and now we're communists, and we just want to help people. So equity versus equality would be a stronger argument and make more sense and be more effective.
Yeah, and since you talked about the misunderstandings of socialism, I'll go back to a term I used earlier. People don't really know what affirmative action is either. That affirmative action, the principle of affirmative action is all things being equal, please consider other factors. So there is no truth to this white male narrative that somehow minorities and women are unqualified in taking my job. It is theoretically, you have two graduates with BAs whose GPA is a 3.6 and a 3.6, and they both have degrees in history and they both have no experience. If all things are equal, affirmative action is include other people that have maybe represented underprivileged populations. And interestingly enough, in terms of the tracking of affirmative action by the federal government, the number one demographic group to have received the most benefit from affirmative action is white women. So there are problems with the program in and of itself if it's reinforcing white privilege by benefiting white women, but maybe that's might be another conversation. Let's wrap this up. So diversity is what? Everything we've just been talking about.
Everything we just said, yes.
Give me one sentence. Diversity is?
Well, I do want to go back real quick. You had mentioned you want to talk about the word queer because I keep using it. A colleague of ours who identifies.
Did you notice I tried hard and I used it in our conversation? That was a moment for me.
It's okay. It's okay to use the word queer in my eyes. And I didn't use the word queer, and I was actually very hesitant to use it even after I identified as lesbian because I as well came from a Southern culture, in my case Southern, where that is a negative term. It's an insult. It's what you see tagged on the sides of the buildings, making fun of gay people or threatening violence. However, it was actually an art exhibition that changed my mind. And it wasn't until less than 10 years ago, actually, a colleague of mine in the art history department at University of Arizona put together an exhibition of paintings in the museum, and they were all landscapes, and the title was Queering Landscapes. And I was, why are you calling it that? What are you doing? So he came and he talked to us about what the point of his exhibition was, and it was looking at something that is not, I don't want to use the word normal because that has connotations on its own, but rethinking things and opening up possibilities for different ways of viewing something. And so the purpose of his exhibition was to rethink landscapes in American culture in connection to masculinity. And a lot of his talk had to do with representations of dirt in landscape paintings, which was fascinating, surprisingly. But the idea of looking at a landscape as a marker of gender identity. That is an example of queering a landscape because we don't think about landscapes in those terms. So I embrace the term queering and I embrace the term queer for my own identity because yes, I'm a lesbian, but again, back to intersectionality, I think queer fits my intersections of identity better than just lesbian.
Well, as you indicated, my recalcitrance is based on the fact that it's been an insult in my lived experience. However, what I appreciate about the term, two things I guess I appreciate about the term, and I want to become more comfortable using it myself, is that I, as a heterosexual man, I stumble sometimes on the gender-based terms of gay and lesbian, that sometimes, and it also seems to reinforce patriarchy, right? That just like man can be man or man and woman, that gay is used to describe men, but also is used to describe homosexual women as well. And so I feel like, it's awkward and one of those, just to be self-conscious or expressing my self-consciousness, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like if I use the word gay when talking with somebody who's homosexual, but they prefer the word lesbian, and I don't know that. Because obviously the best thing to do is to ask, but the fact that the word queer is gender neutral is comforting. And then I'll say this, and then if I'm off, you'll let me know. I know you will. There's something also beautiful and sociological about the reclaiming of the word. It's that paralleling. It's not. It never has been as damning and damaging of a word as the N word in American English, but there's something about the reclamation of the N word by African Americans, and to me, again, as a straight white man, it seems to parallel the reclamation of the word queer by gay culture in America. Is that fair, or?
Yeah, I think it's fair, and I hesitate to delve further into that because it brings up that idea of competition again, right?
Yeah.
Which one gets to reclaim first, and which one is more important to reclaim? But I like that you brought the conversation to African Americans, because I'm sure you've noted in our multiple presentations together that I sort of oscillate between African American and Black, and sometimes I say them both. And that, growing up in Memphis, Tennessee, such a sort of mecca for civil rights activism and history, many people that I know, and I've heard comics and newscasters and things say this as well. They say, I'm not African American. I didn't come from Africa. My ancestors did, but I'm Black. And then, of course, you hear others who say, yes, African American. I embrace my African heritage. So I struggle with that, and knowing which one is correct. To your point about, well, maybe I should just ask, but at the same time, that feels awkward because I feel like I should know. I'm a well-educated individual who's from America. I should know what they want to be referred to as. But
Well, I would
goes
argue
back
that
to intersectionality.
you know that there is a diverse opinion on what people want, and that's what the knowing is. And that's what your education and your lived experience is reflective of. I would suggest that the people who don't oscillate between the terms are the ones who are not asking and who don't know. And to that point, I have noticed that you do that, and I also think that one of the things that makes presentations work well, and one of the reasons you and I work well, is because we pick up on each other's language. I despise using the term white. I consider myself to be European American, not white American, and I just generally reject the color coding system of taxonomy of humans. However, I use the word white now in our conversations to gel our conversations in terms of whether we're using the word Black, Black American, African American, white American, European American, and then I think I might have mentioned this to you, but if not, there's also a debate about hyphens. In terms of, there's a call for papers that I just recently responded to, where the instructions were to not hyphenate African American, because just think about what that means in terms of a lot of psychological or sociological interpretations that could happen. And then if we could ever get beyond this, and I don't think that's possible, but I've heard people say, why don't we call ourselves, in my case, American Irish, and call people American African or American, we do use the phrase American Indian, but that there's something to be said about which word comes first. If we're starting with what makes us different, what does that communicate, versus starting with what makes us similar, our shared experiences as Americans.
But are they shared?
Salad bowl or melting pot, right?
Yeah. I think before we close, I think it should be acknowledged, as we acknowledge with every presentation, that we are two white, European American individuals, academics, talking through our experiences and our ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, that by no means are my opinions authoritative. Yours might, because you're smarter than I am, but these are my questions and my thoughts as a white male academic, heterosexual academic too, and one who grew up with a lot of white privilege. Thank you for closing us with that point. This has been fantastic, and as always, I love talking with you. I learned so much from you, and just being able to to figure things out together is wonderful.
Yeah, it was a good conversation.
Thank you.